Warning. All of the stories you're about to hear are very disturbing and graphic. Viewer discretion advised. I once heard a story of a guy who cleans up bodies from people jumping in front of trains. In this one case, they found a body with no head and they couldn't for the life of them find the rest of it. Apparently in the autopsy room, they saw a tuft of hair coming out of where his head should have been, and that's when they realized that he hit the train head on, and apparently his head had caved into his chest right through his neck. I know this one story of an old high school prom promise presentation from the county coroner. One photo that he showed that I'll never forget is one where a car had wrecked. There was heavy intrusion of the roof which had effectively pancaked the driver's skull. It was really bloody and in pieces, but the skin held it all together. Both of the eyeballs popped out, and they were hanging out as well. At only 14 years old, that really fucked me up. I live on a really small island near Japan, so we have a lot of Japanese tourists visit all the time. We have this really popular beach which is listed as our top 3 tourist attractions. You had to climb down some stairs as well as a ladder. Then you'd have to jump down 5 foot into the sand or water to reach the bottom, or you could jump off the cliff straight into the water. The jump from the main cliff was just about 15 to 20 feet. The thing about this beach is that when it gets really rough, the waves hit the cliff sides, and when they do, they reach astounding heights. The waves would get so big that it would reach the parking lot, which is about 35 feet away from the secondary cliff side. There was this one summer where this Japanese male around in his mid-20s went diving head-on into the waves when they were still pretty mild. Still super dangerous, but pretty mild compared to the waves that reached the heights. Well, the next day or so, word had spread around that he had passed. The locals said that he was diving into the waves even after they advised him to stop. The guy would jump into the waves from the cliff, climb the ladder, and then the stairs back to the top and jump right back in. The locals said that they saw him jump repeatedly until he didn't. They called the police. The police arrived, but they couldn't really do much for a while for the water was still very rough. The mist, salt in the air, and sand mixed within the waves made it really hard to see. They searched for his body and they eventually found him in the waters of a nearby beach. He was headless. His body had almost split completely in the middle and his legs were broken. They eventually came to the conclusion that the waves had pushed him against the cliff head-on so hard that his head was pushed into his body as well. The rest of his injuries were because he was still being slammed against the cliffside for hours. There's a Japanese gravestone on the side of the beach. I always walked past it but hadn't learned the story until I got older. I had always thought it was some kind of small World War II monument or something. I guess not. I'm not part of a cleanup crew, but I attend some of the scenes. There was an old gentleman who had died in the bath. The top half of his body was all swollen and puffy, whereas his legs and lower torso had almost melted away. It essentially created this horrendous soup/casserole mix inside of the bath. The coroners had to sift through the bath to find his liver, which had come out. During the post-mortem, his testicles were so swollen that they had to prick them just to drain out all of the liquid. I just really hate the smell. It seems to stick on your clothes. You come back into the office and everyone can smell it on you. Not my experience personally, but a friend of the family who was a first responder. There was a teenage couple, boy and a girl, that were driving upwards of 100 miles per hour down a country road in Wisconsin at night. The male was driving and was wearing a seatbelt. The female was the passenger and she wasn't wearing a seatbelt. The driver lost control and slammed right into a tree. Our friend had arrived first on the scene and found the teenage female had been thrown through the windshield and was in many pieces in the branches of the tree. The teenage male driver, who was seatbelted in, was found nearly completely decapitated from his head to his body, with only a strip of neck flesh keeping his head attached. He had been driving so fast that the impact had caused his seatbelt across his chest to nearly slice his head right from his body. My dad's friend is a cop who works a rural area and loves to tell my dad about all of the fucked up stuff that he comes across. One of them being the time that he was sent to a call of a large group of people that were crying and coughing inside of an apartment. He eventually gets there, and it's a large group of family members there, cleaning up the shotgun suicide of a relative. That's when I learned that it's sometimes up to the family, and it's not always the people in the hazmat suits. I nearly had to clean up after I had found my dad dead back in March. He was home alone, had a heart attack, and was dead before he hit the floor, but he broke his nose on contact since he didn't put his arms out. He bled out everywhere. It went through the hardwood floor and all down the walls in the basement as well. It was awful, but some of my friends from church thought it would be better if I didn't have to go through more trauma as just a 20-year-old guy who just lost the only sane relative he had left. When I was in prison, we would take classes like HIV and AIDS prevention, drug and alcohol substance abuse, etc. Well, there was this one class where guest speakers who were friends with the chaplain would come and share some pretty life-changing experiences with the group. At least, that was the idea. One morning, a guy comes in and he looks like a pretty normal dude, and he tells us as much too. Never been a drug addict, no problems with alcohol, had a family, nice job, and he was a volunteer EMT. He was tasked with cleaning up car crashes most of the time, so not crime scenes, but some pretty gnarly shit a lot of the time. He continues on about how a routine call that he and another guy were cleaning up a serious car wreck. Someone had wrapped their truck completely around a tree. The guest speaker was cleaning blood out of the passenger side floorboards when his hand slipped and he then face planted right in a puddle of blood. He knew immediately that he had it in his mouth and all over his face. I think some might have even splashed in his eye, but I forget. Anyway, absolute worst case scenario ensues. The driver was HIV positive or some type of hepatitis, and he in turn becomes infected. His wife then fucking leaves him, and she tells the kids and the family the father is gay, and they harass the shit out of this poor guy and basically all around ruin this guy's life. Everyone in that room, in a prison mind you, knew that it could be worse once he finished telling that story. He stuck around and answered a few questions. Not that really many were asked. That was it. No feel-good stories, no happy endings. Sometimes life just really fucking sucks. Also, I'm not really sure when this happened. Early 2000s would be my guess. I was told this story during 2015, and the guy had basically just moved on with his life. He had to move towns and start all over. The story also took place down in the southern United States. So I was interning with the forensics unit at the time. It was my first real crime scene. This guy found out that his boyfriend was cheating on him, and then he flew into a jealous rage. Stabbed the guy to death with the handle of a frying pan. Chased him through the house and then finished him off in the bathtub, where he stabbed him an estimated 200 additional times. His head was a ruin of pulp and bone shards. The guy that I was working with tasked me with digging bits of skull from the drain with tweezers. Yeah, it was pretty fucked up. To start this story off, this isn't my job, but I can tell you for absolute certainty I wouldn't ever do it. My best friend and I just happened to be lucky enough to grow up together. When we were 18 years old, we were both about to go our separate ways. I was joining the Marines and he was attending university. However, right before my ship date, he actually surprised me by dropping out and coming along. I really wish he never had. When we got out, both of us seemed okay. He was his usual self and we both had pretty hard times and confided in each other, but other than that, it was totally normal. One day he begged me to go see a movie with him, The Last Witch Hunter to be exact. The next morning, he made us and his father some breakfast, walked out to his truck, and then put a bullet through his head. After the paramedics left, one of which was my current stepfather, it was now put on to someone to clean his truck. I've seen human brains before, but I've never felt them, and I'll never forget it either. It's exactly like Jell-O. Some of it was mixed with fragments of skull and blood splatter all over the right side of his truck. I'll absolutely never forget holding his empty head in my hands. It was harrowing. For this reason alone, I could never do this job. Having personal experience is enough for me to respect those that do it. So my mom used to do cleanup for a certain teal and yellow cleaning company and was the only one certified to do hazmat. They did cleaning for the county sheriff department, and the one that stuck with her was in the back of a cruiser where they had a meth head, as they described him. But he was so tweaked out of his mind, he kept rubbing his face back and forth across the dividing glass and managed to wear his face off from ear to ear. I got to see the pictures of it before cleanup nearly 10 years ago, and it still haunts me to this day. Not my story personally, but my former boss's. His wife is a mortician, and he does death scene cleanup on the side as kind of a service for the funeral home. He said that the worst thing that he ever did was clean up after a homeless man had snuck into an industrial building, then climbed up to the top of a set of seldom used stairs and passed away. These stairs and the landings were only made up of metal grating. Maybe about 2 weeks later, somebody notices the rancid smell, opens the door to the stairwell, and finds the remains of the man that had liquefied and then dripped down 4 stories of stairs. Pretty nasty stuff. Police detective here. In a rural area, a guy had passed away in his yard. It happened around July. It was 8 days before someone found him. He was partially liquefied and there were flies everywhere, and the stench was pretty nasty. The knowing where these flies were before they landed on your face didn't really help. Had to shovel them in a bag with gas masks. FYI, liquefied people are quite toxic. I got caught up in a traffic jam once, caused by a motorcycle accident. It was apparently at high speed. Once we made it to the scene, there were lots of dividers and steel barriers there. I suppose he got caught up in them during the crash, and it shredded him. I knew it was pretty bad when there were dozens of yellow covers no bigger than a foot all over the road. I just remember yelling, "Don't look," at my car mates. I'm not a crew member, but I got a story. A couple of years back, I couldn't get a hold of my brother, so my stepmom and I drove out to make sure he was okay. He lived about 2 hours away from me, and we haven't heard from him in about 2 weeks. It wasn't really uncommon for him, as he did a lot of drugs and was a very solitaire guy. I crawled in a window and I didn't really smell anything nasty, just smelled like a musty old house. Anyways, I got the door open and we found him in his room, and he was definitely a few weeks into decaying, and he was very bloated, and there was blood all over the room. I didn't initially see maggots, but from the report, there was apparently a ton of them inside of him, and they actually mistook the bullet in his head for maggots on the x-ray. We had to go back the next day to his house, and I found his tooth in the closet door rails on the floor. Also, the house smelled absolutely horrible after the body was removed. His hair was stuck to the carpet, and there were a few maggots there as well. To detour anyone from suicide, he shot himself in the head and lived long enough to put the gun under his mattress, and he just laid down waiting for death, getting blood all over his mattress. He realized that it was a mistake, and he eventually got up to try and grab his phone, but he fell over to the spot where I found him at. Drugs are terrible. Found a dead guy in his apartment. He had been there for weeks. We had to process the scene, including rolling him over to take pics. Unfortunately for us, he was literally a dark green glob, and he was starting to liquefy into the carpet and walls. Rolling him over was like grabbing a 320-pound ball of goo. 2 gloves on each hand, and could still feel everything. Also, if you happen to die with your dogs in the same room and enough time passes, they will literally eat exposed skin, which is normally your face. It's so bad. I used to do auto detailing in college for a car dealership. I was scrubbing the floor of a car, and no matter what I did, the water kept having this red tint to it. So I pulled the seats and found about an inch of dried crusted blood, and what I can only guess was brain matter and skull fragments. As it turns out, it was apparently a suicide car that the dealership had bought at an auction. It had been detailed before being sold, but they never pulled the seats. We called the cops to confirm it was all logged and then shipped the car back to the auction. The dealership lost their ass on it, but wanted it as far away from their lot as possible. Search and rescue personnel here. Working in Las Vegas, we see a ton of really messed up stuff. Chances are pretty high that if we're looking for a missing person, we'll probably find an unrelated subject. The worst one was when we were deployed to find a female stuffed in a suitcase. After recovering the female in the suitcase, the coroner said that it was the wrong female, and we were sent back out to find the right one. I guess I should clarify, though we aren't a cleanup crew, we're often tasked with body recovery. The coroner's office does the packaging and LE does the investigation. We then solemnly carry them out. Everyone needs to come home eventually. There's always someone out there who cares for them. Police officer here. I attended a scene where a guy went to his ex's house, walked in, and then murdered her, as well as her mother and teenage son. It was clear from the scene that he had gone in with a rifle and shot the 3, but that the son had attempted to crawl to a phone in the kitchen. He then went out to his car, grabbed his shotgun, and then pumped a slug through each one of their heads before putting one inside his own as well. The son was in high school, and he was well on his way to college football. His girlfriend was scheduled to also be at the house, but had last-minute issues with a family illness. Thank God she wasn't able to make it. My dad used to be a coroner's assistant back in the late 70s, early 80s, and he's had some pretty fucked up stories. The one that always sticks out the most, and I think most responsible for his PTSD, was a car that was full of drunk teenagers on prom night that were struck by a train. He said that the car had ignited and he could smell them burning. They were barely able to identify them, and he had to help move their cooked bodies. These kids were about the same age as my older brothers at the time. Just hearing the story alone scared the shit out of me, and I have never and will never drink and drive. I worked in CSI in Mexico. We once went to a safe house where the police found about 14 people who were tortured and then executed. You could actually smell the iron from the entrance. Upon entering, there were 2 women with broomsticks that were taped to the anus and vagina. In the upstairs bathroom, they found a woman that was tied to the toilet, died of dehydration, and had been urinated and defecated on her for days. It was also evident that they had raped her and beat her before turning her into a human toilet. One of the rooms had 5 shackles on the wall, and in the center there was a metal bucket with water. The 5 people had died from hunger and beatings. The sickest was in a backyard where there was a warehouse without any windows, and there were several bodies that had their faces and hands removed. It was exactly like watching a horror movie, and I'll never forget it. I'm a police officer, and I've been on a good number of death scenes. One that really sticks out in particular was a suspicious death on the top floor maintenance stairwell of a 5-story apartment building. I arrived and I could smell the body from the bottom floor in the lobby. How it took this long for anyone to call in a building that was filled with 100 people is beyond me. I got in the elevator and began to go up, the smell getting worse with each floor. My corporal was with me and he started to look a bit sick. The door to the 5th floor then opened and I was then hit with a smell that I'll never forget. This poor man was lying face down on the top floor landing, just inside the doorway to the stairwell. He had probably been there for about 2 weeks in the middle of July in the southeastern United States. The top floor was not air conditioned as it was storage and maintenance, so it was around 100 degrees inside of it. The man was bloated and leaking his juices all over the place. His skin was this really nasty black color. The juices were leaking down the stairs, dripping into the landings of the 4th and 3rd floor. Now, this was classified as a suspicious death, so the detective had to come out and see if we could rule out homicide just to be sure. As my corporal was currently heaving out of an open window, I had the privilege of assisting the detective with rolling this bloated corpse over in order to inspect it for wounds. I took a hold of his arm and then rolled, and I then felt the arm begin to separate from the body as more of the death juices then spilled from his torso. Luckily, there was no obvious wounds. When body removal finally showed up, even they were gagging. Again, I got to assist with moving the corpse onto the gurney. We had put on full-body suits and masks to move him in case he burst. Luckily, he just leaked but didn't split down the middle. 0 out of 10, do not recommend. Well, as it turns out, the man had a heart attack while on the landing and nobody seemed to realize that he was gone. Once the man was identified, I actually realized that I met him the week before when he called in about a woman who had overdosed on heroin that he came across while mowing yards for work. It's a small world, I guess. This is a third-hand account, but basically goes like this. Forensic cleaner is cleaning up a murder inside of a kitchen in a big house. The police return to the property midway through the cleanup. They silently somehow alert her to the fact that the suspect is still on the property somewhere, then make a show of leaving again. The cleaner calmly finishes off and then leaves. The police find the guy in the house with the murder weapon, and he had been watching the cleaner the whole time. Yeah, pretty damn creepy. Firefighter EMT here. I just had a suicide not too long ago. This guy was caught in one of those local pedo stings like you see Chris Hansen doing. He had his sentencing moved from April to July. Pedo guy writes a suicide note, tapes it to his door, and then walks outside to his carport. Pedo guy has a shotgun and then sticks it into his mouth and pulls the trigger. When I first got there were droplets of blood, brain tissue, bone, and sinew dripping off the carport overhead. Both parts of his brain were miraculously intact. Walked around the dripping brain material to get to the front door and found his suicide note, which was really just legal paperwork stating who was allowed in his home and who to call, etc. On the note was an original date of April XX, and the date was crossed out, of which the current date was then written next to it. When crime scene cleanup arrived, he was the only person available to come, so he was alone. We stayed on scene to assist however we could, due to having a good rapport with the company. He told us that a chemical that they use to clean will change the color of the blood to this weird greenish color if said blood contains certain pathogens such as hepatitis C or HIV. Lo and fucking behold, this shit changed color. We finally assisted him to move the body to his vehicle, and then we called it a day. It kind of feels good to talk about it though, even if it is to faceless Redditors. Now, I'm not a professional cleaner, but I have cleaned up a murder before, unfortunately. My best friend was beat to death with a baseball bat in his own home. It's apparently pretty expensive to have these people to come out and clean, and his parents didn't have it. Trying to do what we could to help, a few of his friends got together and we cleaned it. I don't really have anything crazier to say that I haven't already about the scene. The entire experience was extremely surreal and not something I really think about often. I'd say that the craziest thing would have to be the weird places that we'd find a speck of blood with seemingly no logical way for it to have gotten there. However, logic had left that room before we got there. I'm not a crime scene cleanup crew, but I did have to clean up my father's brains and blood from the room that he killed himself in. The people that were in charge of it basically just didn't really do a thorough job. There were red streaks down the hallway walls from the blood-soaked bed that was being taken out. I guess they didn't have a ladder because the walls of the room were clean up until nearly the roof, and then you could see splatters. I'm pretty damn sure that I found a piece of rotted brain stuck to the top of the curtain rails. There was also a smell that we believe was from the blood soaking into the wooden floors, so we had to have those floors replaced ASAP. Yeah. It's definitely something I never want to experience a second time. A doctor that I used to work with at an urgent care drove to a big hospital and parked. He called them and he told them that he was sitting in the lot and what his car looked like. He said that he was going to commit suicide and he wanted them to harvest his organs. He immediately hung up and then he shot himself in the head. When they got to him, the entire inside of the car was completely wrapped with saran wrap. I guess so it would be easier to clean up. This guy really thought everything through. Pretty crazy. Not a crime scene cleanup, but ex-volunteer firefighter. I had to wake up one morning to hear my pager going off. The incident came through as bio washaway, something that I'd never seen before. Reported location was the local train station. I turned up at my station entirely curious and still pretty bleary-eyed and half asleep. Spent the next hour and a half trudging through cold and wet dewy grass as the sun came up, revealing the fact that half the grass was actually stained bright red. There were bits of brain and bone all over the place. One of my colleagues found 4 bloody teeth. Paramedics carted off a body bag that definitely wasn't full enough to contain an entire body. At least half the time there was spent flushing the area with water, and it took an unbelievably long time for the water to stop splashing up red. Well, as it turns out, bio-washaway means cleaning up biological waste. Said waste being the guy who threw himself under the last train for the night and was then distributed across some 50 or so meters of train tracks. Definitely wasn't the best way to start my day, and it's still pretty memorable even now. I worked as a call center claims representative a few years back. The story haunted me and I had to take the rest of the day off. I received this call from the grandson of an elderly bedridden woman. He was the only one that ever checked in on her, but lived pretty far away, so he would try to visit as often as possible, but that would be weeks apart sometimes. One day he arrived and he opened the door with the absolute worst stench that was making him gag as soon as the door opened. The next thing he saw pushed him through to vomiting pretty much everywhere and then running out and calling the cops. This poor old woman had a brain aneurysm while in bed. She was way too sick and weak to move or really do anything. It had been about 3 weeks between visits from the grandson. Blood was everywhere and the body was decomposing. There was bugs, maggots, the whole 9 yards. The entire room that she was in was stained with blood like a damn bomb went off. As it turns out, she died as the blood pooled into a vessel in her brain. Due to her age and the stretchy quality of her skin, the blood must have pooled almost into like a bubble or something. What he described was that it must have exploded in the room, shooting everywhere, totally coating the entire room. The grandson was filing the claim on our policy that we carried for her property in order to get reimbursed on the hazmat cleanup bill of like 10 grand. I listened to all of this absolutely horrified and unable to really say much. All I really did was just type away the claim. I just told him sorry. I really didn't have any words. An adjuster will contact you with the next steps in 1 business day. Then I hung up. I told my boss about the call-in that I would be taking the rest of the day off. Yeah, it was that bad.